Hi, today I'm going to be talking about some international relations stuff for my comps, namely the assumptions. What are the assumptions of liberalism in terms of international relations theory? You'll hear some whining behind the camera. For some reason, my computer is straining. So, uh, pretty broad and kind of bland topic, but I'll start off with just listing some sources. I'm going to be using Jack Snyder, One World, Rival Theories. I'll also be using, of course, Michael Doyle. After that, I'll be using James Richardson, Contending Liberalisms. After that, I will be using, definitely Joseph Nye. Certainly Joseph Nye. Charles Krauthammer. I mentioned him in another video, but I didn't get a chance to use him, so this will be chance time in the comp to use him. Who else will I be using? 2, 4, 5. It's on the tip of my tongue. Robert Keane. The Nature and Source. No, Robert. 20 years of institutional liberalism. I also might be using. I got Jack Snyder, Richardson. That's 2, 4, 6. That's 6 sources to talk about. Oh, that's Francis Fukuyama. Why not? Just throw them in there. That's what people do. So that gives me 7 sources to talk about. I'm going to argue there's 3 basic ideas that carry over through all the schools of liberalism, sub-schools. So one are the importance of, or the linkage between internal and external politics. The second will be about the importance of ideas, slash second image stuff. And the third will be about, the importance of non-military measures. Actually, I might even use Daniel Dudney and John Eikenberry. I want to talk about that. So this is actually similar sources to what I used when I talked about democratic peace theory, because in many ways they're similar theorists. Democratic peace theory is a very liberal theory. So when it comes to comp, I'll probably answer one of these or the other. Otherwise, I mean, it's not. It's going to be a pretty broad overlap, and I'm pretty sure the comp assessors won't like that. So, liberalism. I'm going to argue that all the subschools of liberalism share share an internal and respect for the linkage between internal and external politics. 2, that they both stress the importance of ideas and the difference of that liberal democratic states act fundamentally differently than non-liberal democratic states. And 3, that non-military measures count for a lot in international relations. That being said, I'm also going to argue that the semicolon that historians hate and political scientists love, semicolon that despite these generally agreed principles, you can have radically different outcomes or radically different recommendations or advised way forwards depending on your point of view. So yeah, we'll start off with talking about the linkage between internal and external politics. So with this, you actually have to kind of define what liberalism is, and I think James Richardson does a good job of that in Contending Liberalisms. So it's an article where he talks about two liberal traditions, one being an American liberal tradition based off of negative freedoms. So what I mean by that is, you look at a lot of, for example, what the American political discourse, it's about negative liberties. So I want the right to not be infringed. Whereas a positive liberty is the right to something, right? And Richardson argues this comes out of the European experience where, if you look at the liberal wave of 1848, the wealth disparity between the very rich and the very poor was much greater than the United States, and there's far less political fluidity. So it was based off of positive liberty. And this kind of goes back to Michael Doyle talks about this in Kant, Liberal Legacies and Foreign Affairs, where a good chunk of Kant's thinking has to do with the idea of morally autonomous individuals. Well, and someone, arguing from a point of view of negative liberty would argue that, oh, well, okay, to be morally autonomous, I need to not have the state get in my business, right? So I need to have the state not get in to overtaxing me because I want the right to make my own healthcare decisions. Whereas someone who really sees liberty as a positive, in terms of positive liberties, would say, well, abstract freedom doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you break your arm and that you have to sell your house. So to gain moral autonomy in many cases, and Richardson makes a pretty good point, it's kind of meaningless unless you have, education, a reasonable level of health, safety, security, all that kind of noise. And, historically we've seen it, right? I mean, demagogues like hungry people. Hungry people are pretty easy to manipulate. So this factors in very much into foreign policy. Different, if you look at different views. So, for example, trade policy, right? States that have a really strong sense of negative liberty tend to have a strong preference for free trade. Like a great example is the United States. If you compare that to example, and that kind of, oh, I hate using this word like this, but we're gonna call it the neoliberal project, and I'm gonna have a shower after I'm done talking about this. So the neoliberal project, the whole idea of you're going to create open borders, open markets, it's a form of liberalism spreading around the world. Well, it is in a sense, but in another sense, Richardson argues we could have another kind of liberalism that's informing our foreign policy, and that would be one of guaranteed rights, guaranteed positive rights, one guaranteed human rights, guaranteed access to education, right? So that these trade agreements might be more contingent on, actually providing for people in those countries, right? So a great example would be the discussion over the, whatever you want to call it, USMCA, new NAFTA, right? The Canadians, for example, were really big on the idea that it should include more environmental protections, it should include more worker protections, and so on and so forth. So already there, you have just a very different, two very different views of what liberalism means domestically, and two, how that can affect how people approach international politics as well. All liberals. Second would be the importance of ideas and kind of a preference for liberal democratic states are different from non-liberal democratic states because they're liberal democracies. Okay, we'll call it that. Political scientists will call it normative, something normative. There are normative differences. It's not the kind of Kenneth Waltz, everyone's the same, or Henry Morgenthau. They're all kind of great power actors. The ideas which govern those I almost said second image units. Maybe I'll have 2 showers. But it's a good, second image units. We'll call them second image units. The nature of second image units, it matters basically what kind of country you are, or what kind of state or political commune, because we don't just deal with states. So Jack Snyder talks about this in One World Rival Theories, where you have both conservative, in the American tradition, both conservative and liberal liberals. So you can have conservative liberals if you're talking about international relations. And a great example of a liberal would be Robert Keane in 20 Years of Institutional Liberalism, right? He's saying, if we want to carry on with the liberal project around the world, we need to build institutions. So we should have courts of human rights which hold individuals accountable for actions against other individuals where the state can't do that. So it's liberal state, kind of some of those ideas that govern the liberal state, we'll put them into an international institution. That international institution will then enforce those liberal values in non-liberal countries. And that's where we should really focus our effort. Institutional liberalism is great. On the other side of it, you have a guy named like Charles Krauthammer. So Charles Krauthammer, he's writing, I believe in the 90s, where he says, we're not even multipolar anymore. The realists are wrong. We've gone to unipolarity, and unipole is the United States, and presumably its allies. And we're ruling the world. So what we should do is we should find weapon states. So there's non-liberal democratic states that have access to weapons of mass destruction. Now, he says we can't have states have weapons of mass destruction. But there are a lot of democracies with a lot of weapons of mass destruction. Like, goodness knows. British arsenals and French arsenals and Trident submarines and Minuteman missiles and all that kind of stuff. So he's saying we should rid the world of threats to liberal democracies. He's kind of saying we should go on the war path. We have a moment. We can just do it all right now. Two very different views of both liberal. Both are saying liberal states are better, and we should carry those liberal values. And one guy says we should do it through courts, and the other guy is saying we should do it through the sword. I'd venture to say most people are probably kind of sick of the Charles Krauthammers of the world right now. Guns are expensive, anyway. So that's a great example of that. A third example would be non-military factors. Liberals are really big on this. Realists deal with power, and they're dealing primarily with military power. And in fact, so for example, take Paul Kennedy's The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. Economic power is important because it provides you military power, and military power is what you need. Morgenthau, he's writing about the power man versus the economic man. So realists really focus on this. Liberals tend to focus on economics as well. So, but just because you're focusing on economics, you can draw very different conclusions from those economics, right? Or other forms of power. So one great one is Joseph Nye. Joseph Nye in Smart Power, he argues we should use, or it's soft power. He argues we should do something called smart power, which is you take the very real hard power assets you have. So hard power is defined. Okay, I got this when I took a course with Dr. David Haglund at Queen's. People talk about, we should use sanctions because it's good soft power. Sanctions aren't soft power! You're threatening people, you're using force, you're causing suffering. That's hard power, man. If you shut down a country's economy because you've seized their assets overseas, they have no liquidity, they can't buy stuff, they can't replace their parts, you're, I don't know, maybe interfering with them using cyber tools or whatever. That just because they're not blowing stuff up doesn't mean it's not hard power. That's hard power. That's coercion. Soft power is it's cultural stuff. It's getting people to do what you want them to do without them wanting to do it. So if you're looking at the U.S.-China soft power back and forth, fascinating, right? So like Joseph Nye would argue that we have to be more engaged in using soft power to kind of, taking on China. If we're going to take on China, we're worried about the rise of China, we're worried about Chinese activities, we want to shape China's behavior. You could say one approach is one that's kind of being taken right now in the United States, of we are just going to whack them with trade stuff, right? We're going to put import duties, we're going to have tariffs, we're going to send ships to Vietnam. We're gonna do all that kind of stuff, and that's one way of doing it. But I look at the footage online of the protests in Hong Kong. They're flying the Stars and Stripes, man. Like, that soft power really means something, right? And I imagine if I'm a Chinese leader and I'm looking at the people who have spray painted the Hong Kong Assembly Building and are tearing down the surveillance towers they have, and they're flying the Stars and Stripes and singing the Star Spangled Banner while doing it. Like, man, that is terrifying, right? Even Tiananmen Square, they kind of built a rough copy of or I should say rough copy, an homage to the Statue of Liberty. That's soft power. On the flip side, Chinese are also using soft power. So Confucius Institutes, where it's, universities, you're not here to educate people, you're here to make money. So we'll provide this Confucius Institute, and we'll teach you Chinese because universities are too fucking lazy to run language programs on their own anymore. And we'll... well, suddenly, there's a certain beauty to harmony and order, and you're getting those ideas through, and maybe the Chinese have a point of view, and those people kind of go vote. That's a form of soft power, right? So Nye's arguing that we need to build up our soft power, or we need to do smart power, which includes building up our soft power by kind of really getting ourselves out there and encouraging, using our hard power in a way that doesn't interfere with our soft power. I could go on about this, but I won't. I'll talk about an alternative position, and that's taken by Francis Fukuyama. Although he's kind of walked back on this, but I'm going to talk about the end of history because it's an IR comp. It's really hard to talk about IR as a field without mentioning H. Carr, Hans Morgenthau, Kenneth Waltz, Immanuel Kant, Thucydides, although I'm not sure how I can work him in there. I'll try. And of course, Francis Fukuyama. Anyway, Francis Fukuyama, in The End of History, he basically wrote, liberal democracy is the pinnacle of ideological development. Like, we can kind of do whatever we're doing because we are the end state. It is not a development. We just need to kind of preserve what we have, and eventually people will all fall in line and they'll become post-historical. And he actually referred to societies that are either living in history or after history, and we happen to have reached post-history. That was his recommendation, that we should liberal democracy should kind of keep doing what they're doing. Not as engaged as Nye, and Nye's probably right on this one. Yeah, so who else did I not mention? So I mentioned Jack Snyder, I mentioned Michael Doyle, oh, yeah. I mentioned Joseph Nye, I mentioned Charles Krauthammer, Mary Roquet, and Francis Fukuyama. Yeah. All right. So, that's it. That's liberalism for you. To sum up, we've got liberalism as a school of IR, which is different than in many countries how it's used, big L and small L liberals. But in terms of international relations, the subschools of liberalism, they can come to vastly different conclusions, but they all agree on three things. One is the kind of the permeability between internal and external politics. Two, the uniqueness of liberal democracies. So when states are dealing with each other, if they're liberal democratic states or not, that matters quite a great deal. And three is that not just military and power matters. You have other kinds of power which have to be brought up in any kind of global view of international relations.